Hello and welcome back to the EnvirotechOnline podcast, your regular guide to the latest shifts in environmental monitoring, regulation and innovation. As always, I'm Jed Thomas, editor of EnvirotechOnline.
And my name is Alan Booth. I'm senior editor here at ILM Media. Jed, today's episode is all about citizen science and whether it's about to move from the sidelines to the front line of environmental monitoring.
That's exactly right, Alan. We're seeing a major shift in the structure of environmental oversight across the US, UK and EU. The general trend is that central governments are pulling back, not just from enforcing regulations, but from collecting the data that makes that enforcement possible.
That sounds like a pretty serious gap. So who's going to be stepping in?
Well, increasingly, it's the public and public institutions. Individuals, schools, NGOs and community groups are using sensors and open data tools to track pollution themselves. It's no longer just a hobby, it's starting to become a sort of structural response to this hollowing out of formal central government oversight.
Okay, well, I'm loath to do so, but let's start in the US. What's happening over there?
Well, under President Trump's administration, his second term, environmental deregulation has certainly accelerated. I think it's worth just quickly noting, actually, because we had Earth Day a few weeks ago, and when I was looking into that, it's actually very clear how recent a lot of our environmental monitoring regimes are. I mean, in the US example, the EPA didn't exist until 1970, it's only 50 years old. And over that time, there's been all sorts of changes in its focus, and things have been rolled back and things have been pushed forward. So I think it's worth saying that, this new trend of environmental deregulation is new to some degree, but it's also kind of a return of the status quo. So the White House has recently clarified that they're aiming to cut the EPA's budget by 65%, a massive, massive cut. And the agency's leadership under Lee Zeldin is actively reviewing the legal basis for lots of environmental regulation of particular pollutants. The main one has been the changes to the legal basis for greenhouse gas regulation, which is important for people working in industrial emissions monitoring. Specifically, they're taking aim at the 2009 endangerment finding, which is called the endangerment finding because it was the first time that the EPA made a conclusive case that industrial emissions of greenhouse gases did pose a threat to public health. So beyond this, there has been reports that the EPA is pursuing a change to the chemical risk evaluation framework, which will mean that lots of pollutants and toxic chemicals in consumer products will now potentially over the coming years be deregulated. So we could see an influx of things like PFAS, of phthalates, endocrine disruptors and carcinogens into the environment. So there's a clear trajectory in the contemporary EPA towards environmental deregulation.
All of that is just so huge. But I heard something also about air quality monitoring being shut down as well.
Oh yeah, exactly. The State Department quietly at the beginning of the term dismantled the global air quality monitoring network that is run out of US embassies around the world. There's about 80 embassies and consulates that this network is deployed in. And it's important because in lots of these countries where the US has embassies and consulates, this data from the American International Air Quality Monitoring Network is basically the most reliable and comprehensive data that is available to those governments in those countries. So the people that are going to be losing out, the countries that are going to be losing out from this dismantling are the countries that themselves have the least ability to monitor the environment.
So this isn't just about domestic cuts, it's affecting the global research community.
Yeah, exactly. And also things like research institutions across the US that are really important for global science, things like the NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which does lots of climatology that is then used around the world, sort of lays the basis for lots of climatology. That is having its budget cut, its staff is being massively reduced, which will have a massive impact on our ability to monitor climate change and our responses to it. But that's not all, unfortunately. The legal frameworks are being eroded too. And this is even more important because the Trump administration will eventually be over, and whoever his successor is, we don't know. But the Supreme Court, obviously the justices serve for life, so if there's a shift in the general opinion of the Supreme Court, this has a much longer term effect. We saw things like Sackett v EPA in 2023 and Ohio v EPA in 2024, where the Supreme Court rolled back protections on wetlands and blocked cross-state air pollution rules, i.e. it was no longer required for states to be responsible for any pollution that crossed state lines. So yeah, if a new administration comes in with stronger environmental goals, the legal foundation for lots of these standards are now looking quite shaky.
I don't know what to say. I assume similar things are happening here in Europe.
Yeah, somewhat similar. The big headline one would be the new omnibus simplification package, which changed lots of the rules around the corporate sustainability reporting directive. It basically cut the number of companies that were subject to the corporate sustainability reporting directive by about 80%. So that's a huge number of companies that are now no longer required to provide detailed reports on their sustainability and their effect on the environment. And even things like now it's no longer required for companies to have sustainable supply chains. Their suppliers no longer have to comply with this directive, which they did have to before. So that's a general sense, that's a general indication that the EU is moving towards a slightly more lax approach to environmental pollution.
And what about at home in the UK?
Yeah, so the big thing there is that the Labour government in the UK has just reformed planning permissions in quite a drastic way that will change how we do environmental assessments when it comes to developing land. Under the new regime, developers will be allowed to cause some amount of environmental damage in certain areas as long as Natural England has a plan to remediate that area. Or, and this is sort of a crucial potential loophole if you want, if Natural England has a plan to remediate or protect a similar environmental feature elsewhere in the country, a particular area that's being developed could be degraded, because somewhere else in the country, something similar, a similar habitat or species or plant or whatever you want is being protected somewhere else. And it's been very clear that ministers consider conservation requirements to be barriers to growth, and growth is the sort of watchword of this new government. So that is quite a massive change, actually, to how we monitor the environment when it comes to building. And this will have an impact on the environment.
So across all the three regions, there's a trend, and it's less state involvement in monitoring.
Yeah, by design or by default, really. Public monitoring is becoming weaker. Central government monitoring is becoming weaker, which is leaving a void which citizen-led monitoring projects are increasingly stepping into.
So let's talk about that. What kinds of citizen science have we been seeing?
Well, it runs the gamut, really. You've got community groups measuring PM 2.5 air pollution outside schools, NGOs testing nitrate levels in agricultural runoff, individuals uploading data from air sensors to global platforms, local, practical, often for the most part driven by concern for public health. It's about whether our drinking water is polluted or our air quality is suffering, especially for young children. But it can also be about ecosystem protection as well.
And when we think about the data that's generated from projects such as these, can they actually be used in regulation?
Well, to some degree. They can be used to challenge official numbers, flag pollution events that weren't picked up by the official monitoring structure, or even trigger investigations under certain laws. If you have evidence that there is a breach of pollutant levels in drinking water supply, if you have decent data for that, you can trigger an investigation. But there are challenges when it comes to using the data gathered from these projects in official investigations or holding people to account, because the people doing these investigations aren't necessarily trained monitoring professionals. So there are problems with data quality, calibration of the instruments, which can make it harder for these things to be admissible in legal contexts.
So with all these things in mind, what's your take on how this is going to affect the environmental monitoring sector?
Well, in some ways, it means that environmental monitoring instruments are becoming a diversified market, you've still got demand from traditional regulators in certain areas, but now you have a whole host of NGOs, schools, community projects, like I was saying, even concerned individuals who are interested in buying new types of monitors, low cost, user friendly, and connected instruments. This is a new market, a new area. This is a new set of customers for environmental monitoring instruments.
And I imagine, therefore, that ease of use becomes quite critical here.
Absolutely. This new user base, this new customer base, needs plug and play functionality, minimal training, clear instruction. And whilst accuracy still matters, like simplicity is the premium, and not only just for the instruments themselves, but the data platforms that people are using. You want tamper-proof logging, third-party verification. All of these things are the major selling points for this new customer base for monitoring instruments.
And what about any partnerships? How could companies get involved in supporting citizen science?
Yeah, definitely. There's some companies are already offering training sessions, technical support, even co-designed research programs with universities and NGOs, and many companies that are already partnering with universities. Those universities themselves will then partner with local community groups to help them run testing and use their labs to make sure everything is properly done. For firms willing to invest in education and these sorts of long-term relationships, this could be a major growth channel.
And where would you say that we are heading then for the next few years?
What I'd say is that the demand for environmental data isn't going away, but it is just changing hands. If the government is around the Western world are no longer as interested in environmental monitoring, it's still an important topic and concern for ordinary citizens. So they want to know as much as they can know about the environment. So the legitimacy in environmental decision making will increasingly depend, I think, on data gathered by ordinary citizens.
Which, by extension, means that the tools and platforms that they use will need to step up in reliability and accessibility.
Exactly. If the 2020s are shaping up to be a decade of deregulation, the future of environmental protection lies in networks of sensors, digital platforms, and citizen scientists filling the gap.
All right then, well that's quite a lot to cogitate on. For manufacturers and monitoring professionals, it sounds like we're entering a new era, less about regulatory compliance and more about distributed responsibility, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's well put. And all of these topics, this shifting landscape, we're going to be keeping track of that on this podcast, but also at www.EnvirotechOnline.com. We've got interviews, articles and webinars tailored to this evolving landscape, and it's free to become a member. So whether you are a monitoring professional or a citizen scientist interested in getting involved in some project in your area, EnvirotechOnline is the place to be.
And don't forget to hit subscribe or follow on your preferred podcast platform so you do not miss the next episode.
Okay, thanks for listening everyone. Until next time, take care.
Cheers, Jed. Goodbye from me.